Hello, I'm Mike Lukic, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to use a solver to analyze a specific Nolan-Hold'em situation. If you've been following along with the research on my website, you'll see that I spend a lot of time using solvers. If you haven't been to my website yet, the address is there on the slide, lukic.io. And what you'll see there is a lot of work in the data analysis space, specifically having to do with the applications to Nolan-Hold'em. But you'll also see that most of my work is done at the macro level. So meaning that I tend to study different formations in aggregate. Being a data analyst, a lot of the insights that I can derive are more at that level, where I can pore over a much larger data set instead of looking at individual hands. But solvers obviously are more frequently associated with that micro level study. So the analysis of those individual hands or individual situations where we can get down to the combo level and look at how that's going to behave or perform on a specific board. Now obviously solvers are great for this too, and they can help us uncover amazing insights that can help us better implement at the table. So we can plug leaks, we can develop exploits of our opponents, we can profile or model our opponents, and overall just build a better strategy. But unfortunately, I think that they're really poorly used by the majority of people that use them. And this, myself included, when I first started using solvers, what you'll end up seeing is in many solver analysis videos on YouTube, people simply just plug in their inputs and look at what the solver chooses to do at the combo level and try to derive insights from there. And while you might be able to find some larger trends within the data from time to time, what you'll end up seeing is a lot of inaccuracies in this. Because what most people don't necessarily understand is that solvers are just complex calculators. We feed the solver inputs and it calculates a result. So what that means is if our inputs are off, meaning if we're off on our ranges or if we're limiting certain sizing constraints or anything else with our inputs, our outputs are going to vary significantly. But let's just throw that aside and say, even if we are somewhat accurate and our inputs are right, what that solution simply shows is the strategy that can't be exploited. So it's the strategy that we would fall back on if we were playing against a perfectly optimal opponent. So if we try to mimic this, we're actually leaving money on the table, assuming that we're able to find an exploit of our opponent's strategy that we could take advantage of. Now, that's not saying that solvers are useless, because they're obviously not. And we can find answers to all of these questions actually using solvers, but it's going to take a little bit more work and a little bit of analysis to actually do so. So what I wanted to do in this video here was I actually wanted to walk through the process that I use when I'm analyzing an individual situation. It's an approach that I have tailored to fit my own learning style, and it's worked amazingly for me to make huge growth in my own game. Because while I actually spend a lot of my time on that macro level analysis, I also think it's very, very important to study at the individual board level, to study our construction and actually put in the reps, because that is where our implementation and that's where our execution practices are actually going to come from. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my process with some example solves that I ran. And specifically here, what I'm going to look at, and you see the board on here is a board of ace of hearts, 9 of clubs, 6 of hearts. The board is not really super important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time today going deep into the strategy. I might highlight something here and there to make a point, but really I'm going to spend more of my time just walking through the process. I'm also going to be just analyzing the flop play today, but this process can be used to pick apart any in-game situation. So what I'm going to be putting in place here is a framework that can be applied on flops, on turns, on rivers, pre-flop, throughout the entire hand, etc. So really what we have here is more of a framework, not necessarily looking into an individual spot. For this analysis itself, I am actually going to be utilizing this spreadsheet here that I've put together to compare outputs of solves that I've actually run. And I'm going to be using GTO Plus today, and that's the reason for that is it's my solver of choice for one-off solves, mainly because I really prefer the UI and I prefer how easy it is to actually explore ranges within the tool. I also like the fact that it integrates with Flopzilla very well, but you can use any solver like Pio or Munker or simple post-flop or really whatever you want for this same type of analysis. And if I were doing this in another tool, I would do the same exact thing just within that other platform. So let's get into it right now. And the first thing I typically do in this spot is I actually just define our situation. Now, I actually meet with a group of poker friends regularly to walk through a board, and we vary that up from time to time, and we talk through how we would construct our ranges in that particular spot. And recently we've been focusing on situations where we open a range from the hijack and we're called by the button. And this week we happen to be looking at this board of Ace of Hearts, Nine of Clubs, Six of Hearts, a two-tone ace high board with those two middle cards. And that's what I want to spend time looking at today. So you'll see the spreadsheet that I have here. I have a little bit of details just about the board itself, the pot size, which we opened to $20. We're called by the button. We're playing a 2-5 game, and the blinds both fold. So the pot size $47, and effective stacks are about 1,000. And what people end up doing right away is, I think people immediately will just put their inputs into a solver and run a solve to understand equilibrium. But I actually think that's a mistake. I think seeing the optimal solution is actually going to skew people's own biases. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to start by filling out kind of what my initial assessment is, and then I'm actually going to run my first solve where I'm actually going to try to set up a baseline here. So I've already filled this spreadsheet out and I've hidden kind of some of the values in here, but you can kind of see the first thing here, I kind of wrote my initial assessment here, which was, we're at a position, but we do have a slightly advantageous flop here. We're going to have aces and ace king. Our opponents won't. But our opponents still should have a lot of equity available. It's a fairly dynamic board. And they're going to continue with a lot of hands. So really, we're going to be in a spot where turn coverage is going to be key, as a lot of different turn cards are really greatly going to change the dynamic of this board. So I'm actually going to start off by setting a baseline. And what I actually do first is open up GTO Plus and build out a tree. And when I build out that tree, and I have GTO Plus open right now, I have a set of ranges. So this is the range that we choose to open the hijack with. It's a fairly standard 22% range. And we're called by the button with a 16% range. And you're going to see some of these combos I have weighted at 50%. Some of the stronger hands in this range, like the ace queen suited, king queen suited, ace queen offs, etc. Those are going to be kind of split as 3 bets or calls. And then some of the weaker hands, like some of the offsuit Broadway here, some of the lower suited connectors, these are more split as calls or folds. I do this a lot when I'm modeling defenders or my opponents, I should say, at least. Mainly because while it's hard enough for us to have clarity over our own ranges, so having full clarity over our opponent's ranges is virtually impossible. So a lot of those fringe hands where I think they might do one thing or another thing, I usually hedge by giving them 50% of those combos in the range, just to make sure that I have some level of coverage. So I also build out the tree, and again, the tree details are not the most important for this particular board. I just kind of threw some of these details in. You can get as detailed as you want building this board out, but really what's more important is that you are building a board out. Now, what you'll see here is you're going to see a lot of these little lock symbols up here. And what I actually do here is, again, instead of actually going and um, looking at what the equilibrium solution looks like, I actually node lock every single decision point in both my ranges and my opponent's range. Now, this requires me actually to get down to the combo level and fill out how I will act throughout the hand. And I'm actually going to have to also respond how I think how our opponents are going to respond. Now, again, this is really, really hard to do. So even for us, we can't guarantee 100% accuracy of our own actions at the table. But I think it's a really valuable skill to try to work through. And I think you should be doing your best to actually do it. And it's going to be very, very hard at first. Like, this was very, very challenging for me to do at first, to get down to the combo level and say, okay, well, maybe I'm going to be doing something here in this spot here. I might c-bet. You'll see kind of just looking at on the lock right here. I'm planning on c-betting here in this first solve, king-queen offsuit if I have the king of hearts, but I'm checking all of my other king-queen offsuits, even if I have the queen of hearts, right? So, that nuance is important as you're actually building out what these solutions look like and what these node locks actually look like. And, again, it's going to be really hard at first, but the process is very, very beneficial because it gets you in the habit of constructing at the overall range level. Now, I'm not only doing this for how I'm going to act on the flop, and again, this is our first stab. So this is meant to be our first iteration and meant to be our first intuition to set a baseline for this. But I'm also looking at how my opponents are going to respond. So let's say I choose the larger bet size, and I gave myself, a small 33% pot bet and a larger 66% pot. If I choose the larger bet size, I expect my opponent to, call some hands, to raise some hands, and I split some things 50-50. So hands like, cusp hands. So this in this spot here, ace queen, I would expect sometimes my opponent to raise in that spot there, sometimes for them to call. So I gave them 50% of those combos. Flush draws in this spot here, I expect them to call sometimes, I expect them to raise sometimes. Some of the kind of weaker pair hands, like pocket eights or pocket sevens, I expect them to sometimes call and sometimes fold, right? So, I have a lot of 50-50s in my range here, and that's really because we can't model our opponents perfectly. And our own biases are going to cloud our own judgment. And our evidence is really completely anecdotal. So, we can approximate here, but 50-50s I think are fine to help us kind of hedge our bets in that spot there. Now, again, being accurate is not the most important thing here. What's really important is that we're setting a baseline for how we're seeing the game at the moment. And when I actually run the solve, so I do this for the entire street, and when I actually run the solve, it's not going to tell me a ton, mainly because we've already not locked all of the nodes. So it's not going to actually solve this street because it's really just plugging in the calculations based on the decisions that we make for this street for the rest of the hand. So we could look at turns and rivers, but again, I'm not really caring about turns and rivers as much right now. So what I am going to look at is these two numbers down here, which is one, our equity, so about 56%, and two, our EV. So we're capturing about $27 of EV, almost $28, and villain is capturing about $19 of EV. So when we actually go back to our spreadsheet here, I actually put that into my calculator here, or my spreadsheet here. So this first iteration here, it's my best studied guess as to how to construct this scenario. We have a 56% equity. We have a 27.8% EV. I actually also derive two other metrics. So I derive my EV percentage, and I derive EQR. And I touch on both of these on my website as well, and you can go to my website and take a look at some of the details of those. But really what these metrics are actually doing is they're saying the same thing, right? So the EV is measuring the percent of the pot I'm actually capturing here. So I'm capturing 59% of the pot, and the EQR, what that's measuring is at what percentage am I actually over realizing my equity. So what we want is we want EV to be greater than equity, right? So we want to be capturing a larger portion of the pot than our equity is, and we are in that spot, which is great. And we also want our EQR to be greater than 100% because we want to over realize our equity. So these two metrics kind of say the same thing, but they say it in two different ways, which is helpful to actually look at. And that's essentially what I'm trying to go for here. And what we see is actually that's kind of difficult to actually do. It's hard to over realize your equity out of position. So, within my own strategy here, and actually I kind of write some notes. That's what I have here on the right hand side. Is I'm happy that I'm over realizing my equity in this spot, which means I'm doing something right, because it's hard to over realize your equity out of position. But I'm wondering actually here, when I first look at this, is am I underestimating our range advantage? So 56% is a lot of equity, and I'm actually going to want to understand if I'm not betting actually enough here. And, in these cases, my checking range is probably well protected and is going to do fine bluff catching, but my betting range can probably be expanded or shifted a little bit into the larger bet size, because I'm probably leaving money on the table in some good spots here. So, what this actually does here is this sets the baseline for the rest of my analysis, because the rest of my solves, I'm going to end up comparing back to this initial strategy, hopefully trying to find ways in which I can actually improve that strategy. So once I have my baseline done, now I actually, before I even jump through the solves, I look at the ranges. And I probably could have done this first, but I like to, go through my first solve without having any outside biases affecting my decision-making process whatsoever. But I actually like looking at this now in Flopzilla. So I plug my ranges into Flopzilla, and you see here, again, this is our 56% range against our opponent's 44% range. And I like to really look at a couple things. One, to look at, how I'm distributed, my range is distributed. And you see here, I have a lot of top pairs, and that's really a big portion of my range, where my opponent's going to have a lot less of those top pairs. And, we really see this. I love looking at these equity graphs. This is like one of my favorite things to study when I'm actually doing some range construction. And you'll see here is that while we do have to be somewhat careful with our betting, because we run fairly symmetrical at the top of our range, and, that's mainly because, while we have aces and our opponent doesn't, we both have nines, we both have sixes, we both have ace nine, we both have ace six. So we both run fairly symmetrical up at the top of our range. But, then there starts to become a pretty huge gap in our range where we're going to be able to push equity with a lot of hands in our range here, mainly because we're going to have stronger aces and more aces than our opponents. I also like looking at, things like, this hotness matrix, which we can kind of see, as we're starting to construct, we can see what turn cards are particularly good for us. So, anything that's not a heart. So, hearts are not great. Some are better than others. But aces, nines, eights, sevens, aces, and then anything nines and below are fairly decent for us. Where any of those, middling cards, king, queen, jack, 10, especially the tens, are not as good for our overall range moving forward. And this is our overall range. This is not also necessarily our betting range or our continuing range, but it's just something to look at and understand. We do have 28 cards here that are actually going to increase our equity, and we have 21 cards that are actually going to decrease our equity of our overall ranges, depending on how we actually narrow those ranges on various actions throughout the flop. So the next thing I actually want to do here is I actually go and run 3 different solve iterations to test my strategy. And the first solve iteration I actually do here is I actually go and unlock everything. So this is the same exact setup, but I unlock all of my nodes here in this spot. And what this is ultimately going to show us is the equilibrium solution for this actual scenario here. And it's going to, neither player is going to be exploiting the other in this spot. It's just going to be the equilibrium solution, or an equilibrium solution that exists for this formation with these ranges. And what I'm going to want to do is I'm actually going to want to compare my EV from the first solve to this. And I can go back to my spreadsheet here, and you'll kind of see me as I fill this out. You're going to see that my EV in my first solution is better than the EV for my equilibrium solution. That's a good thing, right? So, and that's what I want to see anyways. If I'm making less money in my first solution, against my perceived opponent's strategy than I am in this equilibrium solution, then I'm likely doing something wrong in my initial strategy, and I have a leak. And the reason for that is that, if I'm making less money than I would be in an equilibrium strategy, I'm incentivized just to move towards equilibrium and play a strategy that's much more comparable to the equilibrium strategy and move towards that strategy. So the fact that we're making more in our first solve than this one is good. But what I also like to do is when I'm actually looking at the solves, I actually do like to look at some of the selections of the solver. So I like to look at the hand classes the solver is choosing to do and what it places in various splits. And I try to take notes to on my spreadsheet here. I also try to understand the bet sizings that it chooses. So in this case here, my splits are fairly accurate or fairly close to what I chose in my initial solve. But at equilibrium, the solver's choosing the small bet size almost exclusively and not really choosing the large bet size. So, again, not necessarily something we may have to shift, but, just something to note. And then finally, I like to look at, how is my opponent at equilibrium responding to this bet. So, they might have a little bit of a raising strategy against a small bet, but, not really have a raising strategy at all against a large bet. Again, the details here are not as important. I just try to write some notes based on what I actually see in the equilibrium solution. But ultimately, the biggest, most important thing here is to measure, am I making more money in my initial solve than I am in this equilibrium solution here? So after I run through this, I run my third solve, which is I actually keep my initial strategy again, but now I unlock all of the villain's responses. And what this is going to ultimately determine is the maximally exploitative play against my strategy. And if I can understand the best way to counter my strategy, and if I have any serious leaks, this will help me do so. So I can note my EV in this spot here, and I ultimately fill out this row of the spreadsheet, and you'll see here that this number for my EV is lower than my EV for number one. It will always be lower for number one, and the reason being for that is my strategy hasn't changed, but now I've unlocked the villain, and I'm saying now the clairvoyant solver is choosing the best strategy to exploit my own strategy. So it's always going to be lower than this first strategy here. So I'm not worried when I see that this number is lower than the first one. I want to see it. I would be worried if this was much lower. So if I saw my EV was drop down to, in the teens or a low number, that would be a problem, because then I could be fairly easily exploited. Possibly significantly, and it could indicate some type of major leak to plug. But what's more important here is actually, in this case here, looking at how my opponent could maximally exploit this strategy. So in this case, I'm definitely looking at the individual hand classes here. So against my large bet size, my opponent is basically folding almost everything. And the hands they are continuing with are some of its strongest hands, like flush draws, sets, and pair plus flush draws. But even hands like ace X, like ace queen, is folding in full coverage, which is crazy on just to a single bet. But against my strategy, it's choosing to do so. And then against my smaller bet, it's essentially raising almost everything that it's choosing to continue with, and it's raising a lot. So what this indicates here is that I'm probably less protected in this smaller bet size range, and I'm too strong in the larger bet size range. So it's something I may want to consider as I'm actually choosing to construct going forward. And then when I do check, my opponent is betting virtually everything, which again, in that spot here, I'm probably not as protected in my checking range as well too. So this is going to help me understand, do I have potential leaks that I can be plugging, and how could my opponent exploit me. What my goal here is really to find something that's as close to the equilibrium strategy as possible. Now, some of the results here are going to be unrealistic. Now, do I really think that if I'm betting, my opponent is going to be raising 45% of their hands? No, I don't think that they're actually going to be doing that. That's okay. It's more representative to understand that this is the worst case situation against your strategy, and this is what you're leaving yourself open to. So if you see things in here that does not represent, that does represent what villain might be doing, then you may want to work on areas to shore up these spots. Finally, the last iteration, you can probably guess what I'm doing here, is now I take the spot where I unlock my own strategy and I lock the villain strategy. And what this is showing is the maximally exploitative play against what my perception of the villain strategy is. So, again, here I'm looking at the EV, and I plug this into my spreadsheet here, and now you'll see my value is greater than my solve for number one. And again, it's always going to be greater than number one, because now I'm taking the locked villain strategy and I'm saying, what is the best possible way that I could play against this strategy? And what's important here is I can actually look at this and I can see, are there places where I'm potentially leaving money on the table? Now, what's interesting is in this spot here, you'll see that at equilibrium, it was pretty much choosing to bet everything at the smaller sizing. Against this particular villain, it's split, and it's much more split to the larger sizing here. So we're betting a lot more of our hands for 2/3 pot, still retaining some of our hands in the 1/3 pot, and still keeping with the checking around half of our overall range. This is a really good way for us to understand ways in which we can improve our own strategy. So, again, we can look to see where we're potentially leaving money on the table against this particular opponent, and we could also begin to identify hand classes that we should be playing differently. So, one of the things I notice here is that the solver is really choosing to bet a lot of these 6x hands, or hands that wrap around the 6, like 7-5, 5-4, etc., for a large sizing here. And things like that, or insights like that, can be really helpful in construction, or actually how we should be building out a strategy against a particular opponent. And finally, I think we can uncover some population exploits in case of potentially huge gaps to the equilibrium, which is obviously reliant on how well that I'm actually profiling my player pool. So now that I've run these other solves, before I go and build out my own strategy again, I want to run one more solve. And what that is actually I take this strategy, this max exploit strategy that we just derived here by locking villain. I actually lock this strategy and I unlock the villain. So this is the same way that max exploit strategy that we had just learned from solve 4. But now we're seeing what's the best counter against that particular strategy. And when you look at the spreadsheet here, what you'll see is the EV now drops down to 25.6, which is, again, this is going to be lower than the overall equilibrium strategy. It's always going to be lower in this spot here because we are opening ourselves up for counters by not playing an equilibrium strategy. However, what you'll also see in this case here is we're comparing it to solve number 3, and because that's the best counter against our previous strategy. And what you'll see here is not only does this solve here from solve number 4 have a higher ceiling than our original strategy, but the max exploit that villain has against us is not as bad for us as it would have been in our original strategy. So this 25.6 that we earn in EV is higher than 24 here in this spot here. So, again, this is really, really important for us. And if our EV is better in this case, which it is, it might be really good for us to actually build a strategy off of in this case here. If it's actually not, so if we get into a spot here, if this EV was down to 22 and it was worse than this overall strategy, then it probably is, while it would be better for max exploiting that villain, it also probably opens itself up to more counters by a good strategy. But as we can see here, that this strategy actually is pretty decent. So it not only exploits my opponent better than my original strategy, it's also actually more difficult to counter. So what we can learn from this here is that this strategy is actually a good base to help us build out our updated strategy from. And we can see some of the responses here is when we actually bet. Villain's still taking a large raise line, which may or may not be likely in this spot here. I actually don't think this is that likely, is that we're going to see it fold this much, a villain fold this much, and raise this big percentage of its range. And even kind of at these smaller bet sizes, I don't think you see this many raises that often on this type of board texture. When I check, this might be more accurate of seeing a bet range of around 60-ish% bets versus checks. So this is probably somewhat more accurate, but again, what this is helping us to show is what is the max exploit against this strategy. Now, from here on out, what I actually like to do is I actually like to get back into node locking, and I like to actually get back into adjusting my strategy from the very first solve with all of this information that I've learned. So these last 4 solves, I've compared them against my original strategy to not only compare their overall effectiveness from our success metrics, but also looking at how the solver is choosing to act with certain hands or certain hand classes. So what I also realize is that I'm never going to be able to implement this properly in game. So I'm not going to be able to, using Ace Jack as an example here, actually bet this for a large sizing with on Ace Jack of clubs about half the time, and then bet for a small sizing a smaller portion of the time, and then check 5% of the time. Like there's no way I'm able to mix that effectively. So I like to go back to my original plan, which is doing everything in pure strategies at the combo level. And I have run a few more solves here, and I'll look at a couple of them. So I try to kind of mimic this, where I keep frequencies somewhat comparable, but I do things in pure strategies. So this is a simplified version of that, where everything is done at the combo level as a pure strategy, where I think I could potentially execute this at the table. So betting my best aces for the larger sizing, and then down a little bit for my slightly worse aces for the smaller sizing, and then checking my very worst aces. Betting a lot of my flush draws for the larger sizing, betting some of the backdoors for the smaller sizing, etc. Right? So you're going to end up seeing, I'm not going to save that, but I accidentally clicked over that as part. But you'll see just different ways where I actually am able to look at how villains are actually responding to my simplified strategy. And I again note my EV and write that up here in my spreadsheet, and you'll see it drops down to 24.6, but that's still better than this 24 in this spot here, which is a good thing for me here. And that's really what I want to compare things to, is whenever I'm comparing my own strategy against the optimal response, I want to compare it to solve 3. Whenever I'm comparing my own strategy against the villain strategy, I want to compare it to solve 1, because those are the 2 numbers that I want to improve upon. Even though the other ones are the optimal responses or the max exploit responses, these are the more realistic ones, which actually demonstrate what I could potentially implement in game. Now, I ran this a few more times, and I ran this once from this solution. I actually also, what I like to do in this spot here is I realize that it's it's hard to split bet sizes, and I actually had this conversation with a friend of mine a couple days ago of a lot of times trying to split bet sizes. It's difficult to do, and it's difficult to maintain, in game. Especially trying to stay balanced throughout the entirety of the hand. So I also like to see, is there a way I could actually simplify this to one bet size and actually see how I would actually perform in this spot here. So I built this again where I hedged, and instead of betting 2/3 or 1/3 pot, I bet about half pot. So about a $25 bet into a $47 pot. And I look at my overall EV for this case here, and you'll see here in this spot here that I actually did a one bet response, and I could even improve on this number even more. So if I can actually simplify my strategy and capture more EV in this spot here, that's a really, really good thing. And this actually shows that, this simplified strategy that I've selected, where I'm only choosing one bet size, and I'm actually able to, choose pure strategies at the combo level, is performing really, really, really well in this particular example. So once I get to something I'm comfortable with against a max exploit strategy, I then run it again where I go back to locking villain strategy, and I won't open up that solve, but I did that again, and you'll see that this strategy against villain strategy ended up earning me $28 in EV, which is better than this $27.80 in EV. So what this ended up being is this is my one bet strategy. It's still exploiting my perception of villain strategy better than my original strategy, and it's also the low is still higher than the counter that villain could have against my original strategy. So these are the types of takeaways that I'm actually trying to come away with this as I'm actually going through these solves. And we could keep going if we want. Suppose if we wanted to test our strategy against a villain that happens to be more value heavy, then we can adjust our ranges accordingly through node locking by choosing more value weighted combos and testing those results. Conversely, if villain is bluff heavy, or if they're wider than normal, then we can widen our responses and widen their responses and see how our strategy performs against that. Or we can move to a new flop or a new formation or a new street and rinse and repeat. The beauty of this process is it's just that. It's a process. It's a process by which we can follow to get some really good insights about how we should be constructing in any given spot. And what I think that's great about this is because I started with my own biases in solve number one, and everything I do is compared back to that baseline, all of my findings are very customized for me and my game. Meaning that if you are doing this same exact process for your game, the way you construct solve one is going to be very different for you. And the way you do it day one is going to be very different from the way you do it on time number 100. So, but your learnings are going to be customized based on or back to that baseline. So everything here is very specified to your own specific learning. And I think you all get the point here. And the point is that because our inputs are biased and flawed as we enter them into solvers, we shouldn't solely rely on the output from one solve, but instead we should be running multiple iterations where we change one variable at a time. And it's no different than just A/B testing in a different field. We're just changing one variable at a time and understanding the sensitivities that each variation or each decision that we make has on an overall success metric. And we're trying to determine the appropriate ways in which we should be adjusting our ranges based on how those inputs change. So, before I actually close out this video, I have this process here, and I just like to, summarize this process one more time. So, again, I run this in multiple steps here, but the first step is just node locking the entire decision by both players. to ultimately help develop a baseline understanding of our own performance. My second step here is to unlock the entire street or the entire decision to understand what equilibrium looks like. The third step here is to node lock our own strategy against an unlocked opponent. And this is to identify areas where we can be countered. Our fourth step here is to unlock our own strategy against our perceived opponent's strategy. And this is helping us identify areas where we can exploit them more. Our step number 5 is to node lock the max exploit that we saw from step 4 against an unlocked opponent to identify the potential counters against our max exploit strategy and compare those to number 3. And then finally, it's to try to develop simplified strategies from all of these learnings that we can utilize to implement in game, and we can repeat as necessary. And ultimately, that helps us better simplify complex strategies into findings that we can execute at the table. So if you have any other questions or comments, feel free to leave them below in the comments in the YouTube. If you want, I have a whole bunch of other content on my website, lukic.io. I post 1 to 2 times weekly. Sometimes it's about macro level research. Sometimes it's things like this where I'm digging more into a particular spot. Sometimes it's videos, sometimes it's writing, but the general theme is that I'm always focusing on using data and data techniques to better improve my understanding of the game of poker. So thanks again for watching.